Welcome back to the report. In tonight's feature discussion, we look at the safety of nuclear power on the anniversary of the Fukushima accident in Japan. 5 years after the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl, there is still no consensus about the true extent of the damage. Let's have a look at this report.
Once a thriving fishing port, the hustle and bustle on the quays of Onahama appears long gone. 50 kilometers from the stricken Fukushima nuclear plant and 5 years on from Japan's massive earthquake disaster, the fallout is still being felt amongst the trawlermen here.
The law doesn't technically prevent us from fishing. It limits distribution. The question is, in what state are the fish from Fukushima?
Following the 2011 tsunami, some 80% of the plant's radioactive material spilled into the sea. And therein lies the problem. How much pollution is down there and how bad is it? Greenpeace is trying to find out.
There are areas in the ocean where there is still a problem, and we need to know these areas as precisely as possible. And that's very important information for the fishermen, because there are other areas where it is safe and where we see that fish that is catched is actually safe to be sold. And so this research can contribute to locate the problem.
The other problem is knowing if the fish pose a health concern. Since the end of 2013, boats here cast off 2 times a week, catching some 70 different species of fish. But only those with a level of radiation 4 times lower than the official norm are deemed fit for market.
I would like people to have a better image of Fukushima's fish, and that one day they say the fish are the safest on the market because of the rigorous tests.
Banned from operating within a 20-kilometre radius of the plant, and with their catch strictly screened, the outlook appears bleak for these fishermen, as scientists predict the effects of the disaster could last another 40 years.
Now joining me is Stephen Devlin, who's an economist specialising in natural resources at the New Economics Foundation. Stephen, welcome to the programme. I don't know about you, but I find that a kind of scarily imprecise report. Nobody seems to know exactly which areas of the ocean are radioactive, let's put it bluntly, and neither do they seem to be absolutely clear which fish and which fish are not suitable to be eaten. Is it really that imprecise?
Yes, I think there are huge uncertainties around the damage that can be caused by nuclear accidents. And that's the peculiar thing about nuclear energy in general, which is that the risk is one in which the probability of an accident is very small. But if that were to happen, the uncertainty around the actual size of that is very large, and it could potentially be extremely, extremely costly. And if you contrast that to other energy sources, they're radically different. So for example, renewable energy is completely different in terms of its risks. The probability of something going wrong with renewable energy is very low. And if something did go wrong, what's the worst that could happen? A turbine falls over in a field and there's no huge damage. So I think you do have to ask whether the risks and uncertainties that we're taking in the UK and in Japan with nuclear energy are really worth the costs.
Well, that's the sort of baseline question, isn't it? The sort of fundamental question here is, why are we talking about a technology which, if it goes wrong, and accidents do happen and have happened, there's Fukushima, there's Chernobyl, there's 3 Mile Island before that, the effects are so long-lasting and so profound that you'd think that it was a technology that you'd put in the cupboard, lock away and never use.
Yes, exactly. And more importantly, really, we have to be looking at the risks in comparison to the alternatives. So, we know that nuclear energy is getting more and more expensive because of these risks, because we're having to build the reactors and the plants to higher and higher safety standards and environmental standards, and that's bringing greater costs. Nuclear energy is actually the only type of energy that's increasing in cost over time.
And is massively state subsidised, we should say.
Yes, exactly. And as much as renewable energy by some accounts. In the UK, we're currently in the process of contracting a new nuclear plant at Hinkley Point C in Somerset. And the government is guaranteeing it twice the current price of wholesale electricity to that plant. Now, we expect that to be much higher when this electricity actually comes online in maybe 10 years. That price will be much higher than the cost of renewables, even when they're unsubsidized. So purely on the economics, the question of nuclear versus renewables is kind of settled, in my view.
So why do people keep doing it? Let's sort of see if we can get ourselves in the mindset of the people who are taking these decisions. They see the same things we see. They make the opposite decision. Why?
I think there are definitely significant powerful interests behind particular industries. The renewable industry is currently a very young industry. The nuclear industry is arguably much older and more substantial. It has significant backing by some states, particularly France, for example, and it has built up significant lobbying power. So in a sense, we're fighting against the status quo, and that's why these things are very difficult to change. I think there's also an element of the fact that the alternatives in terms of renewables, so wind power and solar and things like that, are deeply threatening to the current economic model in many countries, which are based around highly centralized, privatized generation of power. Renewable energy would completely destroy the ability of these companies to produce energy in that way, and so it's very threatening to give any ground on nuclear or on fossil fuel plants.
So let's just go back to Fukushima. Obviously, we saw there the report about the condition of the ocean. It's not the only damage that's been done by Fukushima, though, is it?
No, of course. I mean, people have died in the original accident. And through the process of evacuation, some estimates put the deaths from that process at dozens. So there's direct deaths that we can attribute to that. And the question you have to ask in relation to that is who really should be bearing the responsibility for all of these costs to people's health and to the environment. I think the focus has really been on holding the company and the executives of that company to account. And recently, 3 executives have been taken to court and are going to be charged.
Taken a long time, though.
Yes, it's taken a very long time. I mean, it is very difficult to attribute blame in an accident that is so complex and does have an element of, a force of nature in terms of the original tsunami. But we also really must actually think a lot more about putting some blame on the system itself in terms of, if you're a government that's planning to privatize and require private companies to deliver essential services like energy that come with big risks to health and the environment, then you have to accept that they're in that business to make profits primarily. So the government has to hold the responsibility for properly regulating and making sure that the public interest is safeguarded in those situations. And that's a problem, I think that's something that it doesn't get enough attention and hasn't been achieved to a sufficient degree in Japan, but also in the UK and many other countries. We have to make sure that the regulatory regime protects us from the profit-making motives that gives no regard really to health and environmental risks.
I mean, with Chernobyl, with Fukushima, the other thing which obviously takes place when there's an accident is that the clear-up time is measured in, decades, possibly longer?
Yes, very long time. And primarily it's going to be the government that picks up the long-term, potentially huge bill for those costs. And lots of people would argue that there's the direct subsidy that we're giving to the operators of nuclear power plants in terms of guaranteeing their prices. But there's also this indirect subsidy, which is exactly what you're talking about, which is that basically the government is guaranteeing that at some level it is going to pay for the costs of an accident.
Well, the then Japanese Prime Minister at the time of the Fukushima thing has said that nuclear power makes no economic sense. Has the climate surrounding the industry changed in Japan since the disaster?
It's certainly the case that public opinion has changed in Japan. So there's a much stronger anti-nuclear popular opinion. As far as I know, I think the government is still committed to nuclear power in general. It considers that to be an essential part of its energy mix in the future. That's largely because Japan at the moment almost entirely relies on fossil fuels. And so it sort of wants to have a domestic source of energy rather than importing fossil fuels. And so nuclear power provides it with a sort of chunky way of getting that. But you really have to question whether or not they've given enough consideration to whether renewables, which are also a domestic form of energy supply, have been given enough attention. In Germany, as a direct reaction to the Fukushima disaster, we saw a policy change where the government announced that it would phase out nuclear power, largely due to the public concern for an accident. The problem is that happened very suddenly, and so of course the shortfall in energy supply was to some extent replaced with coal, which is not what we want. But at the same time, it did release this huge transformation in Germany, in the society in Germany.
Which way is it going internationally then? Because, obviously, like you say, huge turnaround in Germany. Are existing plants simply being replaced? Are countries now acquiring nuclear power and they didn't have it before? Which way are we going internationally? More or less nuclear power?
Certainly up until this point, there has been a sort of stall in investment in nuclear energy. Certain countries, though, do expect to reverse that. Particularly in the UK, we have a big expected programme of construction of nuclear power plants. So there's the Hinkley Point C in Somerset that has been already agreed to, but there's a programme of several others that are expected to come on after that. So, internationally, I'm not sure whether overall there will be a renaissance in nuclear power, but there's certainly particular countries that are taking a conscious decision to ignore, the economic costs and the potential environmental and health costs and risks.
Stephen Devlin, thanks very much for coming in.